Hey everyone, you are listening to the Self-Awareness Journey podcast. This little banter is about a car ride long and features your hosts, JJ Parker and Melissa Albers. JJ owns a tech company and Melissa has been a coach working with influencers for the last 18 years. Today we are talking about children and self-awareness. And as we often do, JJ and I spend about 2 minutes before we start recording the podcast to sort of discuss what's the big thing that we want to talk about today. And is there any specific goal in that big topic that we want to make sure we get across, or are there specific questions we can leave people with? And today we had a really interesting conversation about children and self-awareness. And we decided that it would be really interesting to tell you about that transparently instead of trying to sound like we had all that and a bag of chips ready for the discussion.
Right. What's really interesting about this topic is we didn't really know where to start, right?
Yeah.
There's lots of entry points into the discussion around children and self-awareness, and we didn't know exactly how to approach it.
Right. And it sounds like your dogs are also very much interested in the dialogue. Everybody just ignore that. We're real people too. We have kids and dogs and we're messy.
It's true. There's probably a really juicy rabbit out there.
Yeah. So just to frame the conversation, I have been married to my husband for 26 years, and we have 2 children that are 21 and 22 years old. And JJ, you've been married to Amber and you have 3 children. Your youngest is 10 and your oldest is 15?
Yeah, well, turn 15 in a couple of days. So I got a 10-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 15-year-old.
Yeah. So what's so cool about this conversation is we can really come from a lot of different perspectives. In addition to our family structures, 2 of JJ's children are adopted from Guatemala.
Yep, the older 2 are from Guatemala.
Yeah. So as we were talking about this, the general question that I started wondering about is a child's own self-awareness. And I came from the belief that oftentimes children are way more aware than adults. And they naturally will align with their awareness without any fanfare. They don't get emotionally bungled up about it. They don't. And the reason I came from that is because my grandmother was a minister and she spent a lot of time with me when I was young, sort of going into much deeper things than most little kids have exposure to, a lot of deeper conversations about all sorts of things like that. And I remember when my grandmother became aged and she was very, very sick one day. My oldest son, Mitchell, was 3. And my daughter, Megan, was a year and a half. And I was sitting on the corner cushion of our couch by myself, crying. I was so scared that something was going to happen to my grandma, and I didn't know what to do, and I was so emotional. And Mitchell, at 3 years old, he had a nook in his mouth, pacifier, and he was carrying his blanket that he called Blue. And he walked up to me and without saying anything, just looked at my face for a minute. And then he walked away. And then he came back with his favorite stuffed animal. And he tucked the stuffed animal in my arm. And he wrapped his blue blanket around my legs. And never said a word. He never said a word. And then he just walked away.
Wow.
And I remember
that's amazing. He could tell. He could sense.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And not only could he tell that I was upset, what I always remember thinking was, wow, he isn't really talking a whole lot yet. It's like a lot of blah, 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 with a pacifier in his mouth. And yet here he was looking at me. He assessed a situation in his own mind. He decided what was happening in the situation. And then he empathetically made decisions to try to support me in that situation without even understanding the why, what was happening, nothing. It didn't matter. It didn't matter to him. And over the years, there's been so many examples that I have learned from both he and my daughter, Megan, who are both very intuitive kids. I've been embarrassed many times, actually, by how I have responded to something and then how later they respond to it in a much more self-aware, self-aware sort of experience. And so as we started to have conversations, although I've also had a lot of other children in my life that have had a hard time, have had hard times, and maybe didn't have the same experiences as my children had growing up, or how they were born, or anything else like that. And so it got me wondering, do children have different self-awareness right out of the gate, or not? So I'd be curious what your thoughts are.
It's a really good question, because, when you think about it, us adults, we've got a lot of experiences and different things that have happened. And a lot of times we overthink things. Yeah. I don't know if you've noticed.
I saw a t-shirt the other day that said, "Hang on a minute, I need to overthink this."
Yeah. And I think that overthinking definitely gets in the way of our self-awareness, right?
Yeah.
And actually, I'm listening, to sort of our deeper selves, and so it kind of mask a lot of that awareness. Whereas, you can see in kids that often they don't have that filter. They don't have that part of their brain developed yet that's got that logical filter that's turning all those those feelings come up. Us adults try to run them through the logic filter.
Yeah.
Before they come out, they run it through the overthink filter. Whereas kids, they just come up and right out their mouth, right? Which is awesome.
It is awesome. It is awesome. Yeah, exactly right. Because a lot of times socially or as a parent, we don't really find that, oh no, that doesn't run through that lens well, so that's wrong. Like, we're automatically labeling it, even though we're trying to encourage them to not have a filter sometimes, right? Or have a socially acceptable filter.
Yeah. My 10-year-old, it's her birthday, and the other day she comes, she's kind of sad. She goes, "Mama, I don't want to grow up and I don't want to grow up and be an adult." And it's just like, why would you have to? Just because you're getting older doesn't mean you need to grow up in some of the ways adults grow up.
Oh,
right?
Bless
That was
her
a very
heart.
cute, innocent way of, to me, I took that as like, no, please, Abby, don't ever grow up. Keep this wide-eyed, curious view of the world.
Right. It's interesting though, because as you're talking about filters, what we consider socially normal filters, what we consider, jaded adult filters, things that we as grownups want our kids to say or not say. We want our kids to be or not be a certain way. We want our kids to do things or not do things that we will find okay and not embarrassing, or that we don't want to be called out. We don't want to be called out. And and isn't that interesting? Because that's just being honest, right? We're all like that. And yet we're trying to teach our kids how to have a totally different relationship with themselves. And yet here's where we are. You go ahead and you go ahead and have this relationship with you, and you be open and honest, and you say whatever's on your mind. You have all these things, but but don't get in trouble. Don't do
But do it
anything.
in this very specific way, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. The language I've heard around parenting that really highlights that is I mean, I've said it, I've hear other people say it, is like when they say to their kids, like, don't embarrass me, or you're embarrassing me, right? Like
Yeah.
that's a language that is about the parent, not about the kid.
Mm.
You know,
Hmm.
that's about their ego and
That's right.
their, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
So looking out for that kind of language, not judging it, just
Right.
recognizing it is pretty interesting. Um, I was going to share a story about um, the opposite of
Yeah. Well, I was just
self-awareness.
realizing, and I want to say something before you tell your story, because I just realized that leading the podcast with a very warm, sweet story, while true, is also not representative of many, many families' experiences, and certainly
Mhm.
not representative of all of my family experiences. And so I really want to be sensitive to the fact that I think parenting is really hard.
Mhm.
And I remember one time coming home from a parent teacher conference and standing in my pantry crying. My child was in first grade, by the way, first grade. And I was putting so much pressure on myself that I was standing in the pantry crying because this child had gotten feedback that wasn't favorable.
Mm.
So before you tell your story, I want to say that we are all coming from different places as families and as parents. And there are so many times when we don't know how to handle situations, and we just feel overwhelmed, just
Mhm.
overwhelmed. And so I want to be very mindful of that as you tell your story, because I think your story is extremely powerful.
Well, so obviously, just to put time context around when our conversation is here, the George Floyd murder happened in Minneapolis like last week,
Yeah.
right? And there's been, the rioting and civil uprising and everything, and uh, so that happened on a Thursday, and my 13-year-old was sleeping over at his buddy's house,
Mm-hmm.
right? Friday, uh, I called him because he's still over there after, teenagers like her
Yeah.
middle school kids like spend like the whole weekend at their buddy's
Yes,
house.
exactly.
um,
Or
so I called him,
most importantly, any place not at home. Sorry.
right? um, and I said, hey, buddy, you know, I want you to come home for dinner. We're all going to have dinner together as a family, because, something really big happened yesterday, and I want us to all talk about it. Right. I was like, did you hear what happened?
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, oh yeah, that guy got killed.
Mm.
I'm like, yep. And it's a really important issue for our family. Right. And he goes, oh, why is it an issue for our family?
Hmm.
I was like, well, buddy, because, you know, there's a lot of racial things that, we're exposed with it. And for our family, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And he goes, why? I go, buddy, because you're not white and you're going to have to deal with this
Yeah.
like probably your whole life.
Hmm.
And he goes, oh, yeah.
Hmm.
Like he hadn't realized it. Like he's living, like his bubble, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
racial stuff isn't an issue, hasn't really experienced it. And he
Hmm.
kind of forgot, or he wasn't aware of it. But I thought that was really interesting.
I have a
Like,
question. Do you think that he forgot, or do you think that he just takes it for granted that it doesn't matter? Like, how did you feel?
maybe. I felt like he forgot, but it also could be a non-issue for him, right? Like,
that's what I'm getting at. I just wonder. I wonder.
And either way, it's interesting to think about his context, right? Like, because he's not experiencing maybe these different external events, and he doesn't have this other perspective at all, so I thought that was really interesting, like that he wasn't really connecting, his history and the world's context and everything. It was all just kind of oblivious to him. And obviously that's a big issue. It's a big world event.
Yes.
Maybe we don't expect 13-year-olds to really connect all those dots, right?
Right. Exactly. And there must be a lot of pressure for you to provide all sorts of things, right? Like to provide a safe environment for him to talk about that as he becomes more and more aware. And I bet you have a tremendous amount of I just know you must have a lot of feelings about what do we need to say, be, and do for our children so that they can communicate their feelings, so that they can live in a world that is easiest as possible for them, or easier for them. And I don't think any of us know exactly, especially given the current situation in Minneapolis and in the world. I don't think any of us actually have the answers on how to do that.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting because for us, we have to do our best to parent an experience that my wife and I have never really had to experience, right?
Yeah, that would be so hard.
And our kids will likely experience things that we just haven't. So how parenting it, that's really tough.
Oh my God.
Emotionally parenting that. And of course you just want to protect these kids forever.
Yeah, I know.
I know that keeping them in their bubble is not in the long run the best thing for them. Right. So we have to start bringing up these topics but we don't want to make them scared of the world either. Right.
Yeah. It's such a fine line.
Because I truly believe that like the universe is generally good, right? The good will prevail in the universe. So I don't want to make them fearful of where they are, of their existence, right? So,
right.
But they have to be aware that stuff's, not everything is perfect.
Yeah, it is such a fine line, isn't it? And I think that as a society, we're having more and more of these conversations right now, which actually is pretty good timing for your family in these discussions. And I just sit here and I think to myself, like, we don't have the answers. Like even you and me having this conversation, and we're going to put this out into the world. And there's a certain amount of trepidation. Like, we don't want to say the wrong thing. We don't want to say anything that would hurt someone's feelings or cause a ruckus, because we are well-intended, and yet we don't know the answers to things. And then we have the added responsibility of trying to help our kids. And here we don't have the answers. And we're also trying to help someone who is younger, less developed, hasn't had as much social experience, doesn't have the maturity to think or be or do a certain way, right? So there is this added pressure. And like for me, and I'd be interested in what you think about this, JJ, but like for me, I feel like I will never or I will never intentionally try to say, we have to do this, we have to be that, we have to go and blah, 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 fill in the blanks. What I want to really intentionally be is more and more aware of my own thoughts and feelings, more and more aware of how I am, so that I can help myself learn, be open, and then use myself as an example. Like as an example, these are the things that I really want to be better at. Like I want to be better at being able to talk to my kids about things that are scaring me. I want to be better about helping my kids learn more about the history of our world. I want my kids to be better than me. And I think and to be honest, I think they already are. I think that they already are. And so for me, it's just fostering an environment in our home that our children can learn from the environment and then make their own choices and decisions as they become more and more mature. But I'd be interested in what your thoughts are about that. Well, like, how do you think?
A couple of things. Like, first, with big, cultural things like racism and big problems we need to tackle as a society, right? The first thing is, like, I want to make sure we're keeping good communication open. We're talking about it, right?
Yeah.
I think, like, I actually told even my company, like everyone at my company, like this is an issue, and I want to make sure we are still talking about it after this news cycle's over, right?
Yeah.
Like things that we find important, we need to keep working on all the time, even when the spotlight's not on them. And so obviously for our family, we will talk about it probably forever. And then talking about it's one thing, right? Like we can have a cognitive, logical discussion about the good and bad and the right and wrongs and the values of all of that. But really having both me and my wife and the kids dig into okay, how does this discussion make you feel? Which parts of it are uncomfortable for you, right?
Yep.
And really lean into that. I was having a discussion with one of my buddies the other day. We end up playing tennis once a week, but we play tennis only like half the time, and we chat the other half of the time.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And he was talking about a book he was reading called White Fragility, and he was expressing to me how parts of this book made him very, very uncomfortable. Right. And how he, said, hey, I could have just stopped reading this book, but the parts that were making me uncomfortable, I knew I needed to lean into and really explore why I was having that feeling. Right. And I think if we can raise kids who aren't who lean in to those uncomfortable feelings and not run away from them.
Right.
I think right there is probably the most important parenting thing, at least for me, is to say, hey, kids, you guys are going to have these feelings. It's going to be uncomfortable. But lean into it and explore it, because if you just ignore it and run away, all sorts of bad side effects are going to happen.
Well, it just perpetuates what's already been.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. And I think too, like, I know this has been a kind of uncomfortable conversation for us to have in a way, just because it's so important to us. Our children are the most important things to us in the world. And I think in some ways it is a little uncomfortable to have this conversation, and I'll say that. But the other thing I think is very uplifting about this conversation is our awareness of where we are, our awareness about what our intentions are. We are intending to do good and be good, and we intend to show our children ways of being that they can take and add to and explore and be better and go out into the world. And I think that happens because we're creating conditions and circumstances in our own house that they see that that's the norm, that's the norm to try to be like that. And also to see that we aren't being highly egocentric about it. We're not slamming our fists on the table and saying, this is the only way that you're ever going to get there. We're not taking a hard line stand that causes resistance. We're simply saying, gosh, we're actually doing our best. We don't really know all the answers, but we sure hope that you take all the best parts of these conversations and you own them yourself. Like, we sure hope. And we're trying to do that every day. And I think that is I think that is something that I feel very proud of for myself.
That's awesome. Yeah. I think this is a great topic, and it would be, I think we should have like a Facebook Live or a discussion, with other parents about this. Cause, I would say that, certainly in one way we're talking about how triggers and different, events help us in our self-awareness journey because they give us opportunities, right?
All right. Some bigger than others.
I would say my kids give me all sorts of opportunities every day to be more self-aware.
I know
good and bad, right?
I know my son is going to listen to this, and we've always said that Mitchell is a button pusher, and figuratively and literally, he'd get in the car when he was little and every dash button would get push, 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 push. But Mitchell also knows all of my triggers, and he doesn't even have to, in the dark, he can lean over and use one finger and hit a trigger of mine and just laugh and sit back. So I think I'm with you.
So you're thanking him for all the opportunity of growth he's provided you.
Yes, and we haven't talked about my beautiful daughter at all today, but I'm sure we will sometime. And I know she's probably listening to this going, yep, Mitchell. She used to say to me, and she used to say, all right, here's what I do. She's the second child. And she said, my childhood strategy was always to watch Mitchell and do the opposite. Oh, but she was still good at pushing my triggers too once in a while. Anyway, thanks so much, JJ. I really appreciate the conversation. I know it wasn't an easy one, but I think it's such a beneficial and useful conversation. Yeah,
I agree. Like I said, I think the world would be much better if we leaned into uncomfortable conversations instead of look the other way. So
yeah, me too. Take care. See you next time. We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. Our mission is to help people become happier and more effective by gaining insight into their own thoughts and feelings. We'd love your support. First, share this podcast with anyone you think might enjoy it. Second, leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast site. This helps others discover the podcast so we can reach more people. And third, sign up for our newsletter at theselfawarenessjourney.com. This will help us communicate better with you and build our community. Thank you so much for joining us in the Self-Awareness Journey. We'll see you next week.